and welcome to ACT's election briefing. This episode was recorded live on May the 22nd, the day that the general election was announced.
Welcome to our online briefing for the upcoming general election. And maybe now is a good time to admit that, I've got a direct line to the Prime Minister, direct line to Rishi. He took my advice. I said, let's announce it on the 22nd of May. No, absolutely not. What I can say, though, is, wow, how relevant is this news today that we are going to have a general election on the 4th of July? We are thrilled to have you here with us. If you don't know me, my name is Lizzie, and I'm here to introduce you to John. In a minute, we'll have a little chat with him, and then I'll send the rest of the evening's task his way. So as Christians in education, which I think most of us are here, or we have some interest in or position in education, we occupy a unique and influential position in our communities. And we also offer parliamentarians and potential parliamentarians a particular insight into our education communities. So I hope that tonight will inform you, will give you a balanced overview of the key issues, key policies that may interest us as Christians. It will give us a time to prayerfully consider how we can be supporting and proactive in the way that we ask our potentially elected representatives to act. And hopefully you'll leave feeling a bit wiser, perhaps more able to cast your vote thoughtfully and to pray for those who will indeed be empowered to do some very important work on our behalf. So before I hand over to John and before I ask him a few questions, I was going to ask one of our trustees to pray, but I don't know if David is... David Bedford is our chair of trustees. And although I think he's just finishing off his dinner, his second dinner, he told me earlier, I wonder if I could just ask him just to open with a brief word of prayer so we can commit our time to the Lord.
I'll be delighted. Thanks, Lizzie. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we know that you are sovereign over everything, that you are sovereign over our rulers and those that you put in authority. Lord, we recognise that the timing of this discussion, this opportunity to receive guidance in how to vote could not be better. Lord, you knew your timing as you do with everything. And Lord, we pray this evening we have a great opportunity for us to really reflect and think about the power that we have in our democracy to cast our vote, but also to influence politicians. We thank you for the opportunities that we have, and may we use them to make sure that your voice and your word is at the forefront of the minds of those who make decisions for our schools and more widely across the country. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity. We pray that we will leave wiser and knowing how we can best serve you with the decisions that we will need to make in just a few weeks' time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, David. So I wonder if Joe, could you spotlight John? Possibly. Excellent. So we can see John. Just before we kind of delve into the main content, John, can we just ask you a few questions? So first of all, I'm sure that most people here know what the Christian Institute do, but just for any of us who might be a little confused or may not have heard of the Christian Institute, can you just really briefly explain what you do?
The Christian Institute exists to encourage Christians to get involved, really, in public life, in whatever way that is, in whatever way God calls Christians to do that. But perhaps particularly we have concerns about things like public policy and politics. I mean, we're not political. We're a charity, so we're not party political. but we have lots of meetings in churches all over the British Isles, trying to encourage Christians to get engaged in debates and discussions and to be engaged with their political representatives. And that also involves us. We have a bit of a role as well in talking to officials and politicians about policy. So my role is particularly working on education. I'll meet with MPs sometimes or officials to discuss and to try to get across a Christian perspective on education policy. But my role is also providing an advice service for Christians in education, whether that's Christian parents concerned what their child's being taught in schools, or teachers concerned what they're being asked to teach, school governors wanting advice on different issues. So that's the other part of my job. So part of it's policy, part of it's advice. So they're the two inform one another.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And the other thing is that you have first-hand knowledge of what it's like to be in education, because you are a former teacher, aren't you?
Yep. Yeah, I used to be a biology teacher for many years. Yeah, secondary biology teacher.
Okay, great. So I wonder if there's any other science teachers here. In fact, our chair of trustees is a science teacher, so there you are. You're in good company. So just briefly then, I'll explain how this will happen. I'm going to hand over to John in just a moment. He's going to take us through some of the key parties, their stances or positions on certain issues that might be of interest or concern to Christians. We will have the opportunity to ask questions. Now, in the chat, I have just put a link to a site called Menti or Mentimeter. If you follow that link, you can type your questions there, and you will be able to see other people's questions that are typed. These should be anonymous. Because we are recording this, I didn't want to land anyone kind of on the spot and say names in case people didn't want them to be revealed. So you can ask questions there. You can also kind of put a thumbs up next to questions that you particularly want asking. I think John suggested that we maybe take questions in two halves. So after the first session or the first topic, then we'll take some questions if you can type those into Menti. Obviously, if you're very happy for your name to be revealed, you can do it on here, but it's probably easier if we just do it entirely through Menti, and that should be reasonably easy to navigate, I think. And then we'll do the same after the second topic. But there are also going to be opportunities to just ask any questions about education policy and other priorities for the upcoming general election, although obviously John's specialty expertise is in education. So fabulous. I'm going to hand over to John now. We're so thankful that you can be with us. We really appreciate you being so generous with your time and look forward to what you've got to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Lizzie. Well, it's great to be with you all. I do miss being in school, so it's nice to be with teachers anyway. Again. So we've got an election coming up, and I don't know whether that's something that excites you or whether it's something that depresses you. I mean, hopefully the fact you're here means you aren't desperately depressed about the topic that I'm talking about. But it is easy, I think, to slip into this general attitude of cynicism about politics. And perhaps there are some real concrete reasons to feel discouraged by some aspects of the state of our politics. But I'd encourage you not to despair. For three reasons, really. Firstly, God instructs us to have respect to the governing authorities. Secondly, because politicians obviously are making decisions that really impact our lives, our society, our jobs, our schools, the children we teach, both now and in the future lives, and decisions that will respect God's will or that won't and will lead the country in the opposite direction. And thirdly, we do have some good MPs. Many of them, probably not all of them, but many of them are sincere in pursuing what they think is good for the country. We might not agree. You might not strongly disagree with them, but many of them are sincere in that. And as Christians, sometimes we can feel rather marginalised, but there are some very effective Christian MPs speaking up in Parliament, and there are plenty of other MPs who aren't Christians who will still agree with Christians on some issues, including some of the ones we're going to discuss this evening. And it's also, I think, worth realising that MPs do sometimes change their minds on an individual basis, and sometimes in response to really good debates in Parliament. So I don't think we should ever feel there is a lost cause. I mean, we should never feel that as Christians anyway, should we? But there are real reasons for not giving up on politics, I think. I mean, just a few standout examples for me. The 2015 debate on assisted dying, there was a real exchange of ideas. If you go back on Parliament TV and listen to that, or read it in Hansard, a real exchange of ideas. It wasn't just MPs standing up, giving their view. Some MPs that spoke towards the end of the debate said that they changed their minds because of what they'd heard during the debate. Others said that they'd been unsure at the beginning of the debate, but were now against laws permitting medics to assist people to die because of what they heard in that debate. So parliamentary debates aren't always just about grandstanding. There can sometimes be real debate, really good exchange of ideas that really shifts the thinking of MPs. Or that was a while ago, but recent debates on conversion therapy in both the Lords and the Commons have really shifted the centre of political gravity on that issue, only to some extent, but there's definitely been a change because of those debates. Last month, there was a debate in Parliament on the Cass report, and that's a topic where the dominant political view has completely flipped, both in Westminster and in Holyrood as well. That doesn't mean there are not some MPs who are entrenched, in some of their views, but even then, we know Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Our God can turn the heart of any MP. So we need to pray for them. And, we pray, don't we, that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So that means perfectly, without contradiction. And we know that's only going to fully be achieved after Christ comes again. But we are still commanded to pray, and we still pray that prayer. This is still God's world, which he loved so much he sent his son to die for it. And he is concerned about justice. He is concerned about opposing evil and standing for what is good, even in the here and now, the protection of the vulnerable, including children that we teach in schools, and the families and communities and society that those children we're teaching will help form in the future. So if he's concerned about it, we should be concerned about that too. There's no part of our lives over which Christ does not claim lordship, and that includes our participation in democracy. So we're going to have a look at how we can serve Christ in this election, particularly as Christian teachers, and that includes how we vote. But I'm not going to be telling you who to vote for, obviously. I work for the Christian Institute, and like ACT itself, we're a charity. It's a legal requirement of us that we're not party political. So I will be careful in what I say on some things to make sure I am being as balanced as I can with the different parties. We're focusing obviously on education policy, and what I want to do is highlight some political issues that impact education and say a bit about where each of the three largest English parties in terms of MPs, that's the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrats, stand on each issue. And I hope that might be helpful to you in your own decisions on who to vote for. I'm not going to be covering every political party and every candidate that might stand for an election in the constituency somewhere in the UK. And I'm not going to be covering the parties that don't stand in English constituencies for reasons I'll explain in a minute. There are other parties, of course, SDP, Reform, and others, but I'm going to have to cut off somewhere. So if a candidate for another party does stand in your constituency, it should be easy to find out where they stand. They're not going to be shy about that, are they? So you can find out. I'm also not going to talk about every educational issue. I'm just going to focus on those issues that Christians are particularly concerned about and that relate very directly to Christian beliefs. That doesn't mean that Christian belief is irrelevant to issues like academisation or rewriting the national curriculum or VAT on private school fees or dealing with low attendance, poor behaviour. I think Christian belief is relevant to everything. But there will be more of a range of views among Bible-believing Christians on those sorts of issues. So I'm not going to take sides on them. Instead, we're going to focus on transgender issues, relationships and sex education, just uncontroversial topics like that. And final caveat before we get on with it, education is devolved. So that means MPs in Westminster only make decisions on education policy in England. So if anyone on the call here lives in Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland, that doesn't stop you asking questions of your candidates. But bear in mind, the decisions that will directly impact education law and government guidance in the schools in your country aren't made by MPs. They're made by MSPs or MSs or MLAs rather than your MP. But as we're talking about a general election, we're electing MPs. I'm going to be focusing on education law and policy for England. But MPs for Wales or Scotland and Northern Ireland still vote on that. So they still get to vote on education policy in England. So you can still ask them about it. The parties are sometimes not very explicit on where they do stand on some of these issues. That gives you less to go on in deciding who to vote for. But you can look at that positively as well. It means they've not committed themselves yet. So they're still open to persuasion. They're going to be coming to you and asking you to vote for them. You're likely to get a knock on your door, either from a parliamentary candidate or someone who works for them. So you've got the perfect opportunity to ask them what they stand for on the issues that matter to you as a Christian teacher. They really need to know that these issues are significant in the decisions the electorate makes on who to vote for. That's a really important part of our democratic process and is something we can make the most of. It's also worth saying it's not all about party policy either. You might decide who to vote for based on the individual candidates rather than the party they belong to. Are they wise? Are they honest? Are they faithful? What does their record suggest in politics, whether it's local or national, and in any volunteering they're involved in their employment or in their family lives? And are they prepared as an individual to listen to and try to understand a Christian perspective, even if they disagree? Or are they just dismissive? And what do they personally think on key issues of concern? You know, the views of politicians within the same party can vary very, very widely. And would they be willing to rebel if the party they belong to took a different position? If they're already an MP or have been in the past, you can look at their voting record. And I'm just going to show you how to do that, if I can get the share screen to work, which I was struggling with before. But we prayed and then it worked. So I'm hoping it's going to work again. So just give me a moment. And yeah, that's going to work. Here we go. So I just suggest two places that you can look find out what your current MP has voted in the past. One's our own website, christian.org.uk, and you can click on resources and go down to MP's votes, and then you can put your postcode in or the name of your constituency or the name of your MP, and it will tell you what they voted on in the past on issues of particular concern to Christians. Another place you can look if you want a slightly wider view of votes on a wider range of issues is theyworkforyou.com. And again, you can type in your postcode or the name of your MP and it will find them and tell you what they voted in the past. So those are just a couple of places you can look. And now I'm trying to get my notes to work again. Okay, so let's look at some issues in education where the next government is likely to be making some decisions, or at least should be making some decisions. So let's start with transgender issues in schools. So this is about how schools should respond to children who are questioning their gender. And I'm not talking here about what schools teach, but pastoral care. School policy on how schools respond to children who say they're of a different gender from the biological sex. I mean, they might not put it that way, but you know what I mean. We'll start with the Conservatives, as they're in government. Some people have pushed for the government to change the law to create greater clarity that schools must not affirm a child's social transition, but the Conservative government hasn't done that. But after many delays, it did produce some draft guidance, which says a few things. And again, I'm going to try to share my screen so you can see some of the key points. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. So pupils must never be allowed to use single-sex spaces that are for the opposite sex. Primary schools must not agree to pronouns that pertain to the opposite sex, and secondary schools only in very rare cases as a last resort. And whatever the school decides on that, it must not compel anybody, staff or pupil, to use pronouns they have a conscientious objection to. Male pupils shouldn't be allowed to compete in girls' sports if that would pose a safety risk, or it would be unfair or reduce girls' opportunity to participate. In other words, very rarely, certainly in secondary school. Schools must involve parents and give great weight to their views. And the guidance, I think this is a really key point, the guidance reminds schools that what children want and what's actually in their best interests may not be the same, which is something that all teachers know really, but seems to get forgotten with this particular issue sometimes. Now, the consultation on that draft guidance closed 2 months ago, and we were still waiting for the response to the consultation and for the final version of the guidance to be issued. And if that had happened, then it would have continued to apply to schools unless whoever wins the election actively decided to change it. Perhaps the government was waiting for the Cash report to be published before issuing it to give them some cover, but that was published over a month ago now, and still they didn't confirm and issue the final version of that guidance. Now, because the election's now been called, Parliament's going to be dissolved on Thursday next week, and the rules on elections mean that if this government is going to finalise that guidance, it's got to do so before Thursday next week. If it does, then it will be enforced from that point on, unless the next government actively decides to repeal it or change it. But we're now in a situation where this guidance is not in force, and if they don't do that, then the next government, whoever that is, will have to make an active decision to implement it as it is, or to propose a new version, or to just leave schools with no official guidance still. Now, Labour has commented on that draft guidance when it was issued, and I will show you that statement. So here we go. This is Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. She said, "I welcome the publication of this consultation around the guidance. School leaders have been telling me for some time and they wanted to see greater clarity. It's very sensitive, it's difficult. Really important we approach this from the position of children's well-being, being front and centre, in a way that's respectful, compassionate, also recognises sometimes teachers are placed in a difficult position. I need some extra support around how to manage these situations." And that is literally all that she said. So it's quite hard to work out from that what the Labour Party position is. Is it Labour Party policy to agree with or to disagree with that draft guidance? I think it's fair to describe that comment as non-committal. But as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the Labour Party has not committed itself does mean they can be persuaded without the need to do a U-turn or renege on some kind of manifesto promise. So you could view that as not a bad thing. And my notes got stuck again. Sorry, just a second. Sorry, just bear with me for a moment. Oh, I've just lost all my windows. Just a bit. I'm using a Mac, which I'm not used to, and it's confusing me. Apologies, just a minute. Oh yeah, click there. Get rid of that.
Don't worry. I'll just remind people that they can click on the link in the chat, and they can ask questions. So please do. If you've got any questions that are popping up at the moment, you can type them in at any time on Menti, and the link is in the chat. So please do that if you'd like to ask something.
Thanks, Lizzie. I'm sorted now. Bridget Phillipson made that statement at the end of last year, and since then we've had the final report of the Cass review, and as I said earlier, that's really changed the balance of the arguments on transgender issues in Parliament. It's a real transformation. It used to be, a couple of years ago, even a year ago, if an MP stood up and questioned the whole transgender phenomenon, there would be sort of sounds of shock from a lot of other MPs, and they would be very much on the back foot. But the debate in Parliament on the Cass review more recently, really the tables were turned, and it was those MPs who'd been very pro organisations like Mermaids and Stonewall who were being a bit shy about what they really thought and were a bit on the back foot. So there's been a real change there, and that may be an encouragement to Labour, and it was encouraging to see, I think, some of Labour's response to the Cass review. So, and again, I will share my screen. Maybe I shouldn't have tried to do this, but there we are. I've tried to do it, so I'll keep going with it and hope it works. Okay, so this is Wes Streeting, who is Shadow Secretary of State for Health for the Labour Party. And there's some things he said. So he's not talking about schools. He's talking particularly about the NHS and medical treatment for children. But you can see there, I won't read it all out, but you can see, hopefully, that he's made some statements that are, I think, quite a change, perhaps, from what he would have said in the past. In fact, he actually says that. He says, if you asked me a few years ago on this topic, I would have said trans men are men, trans women are women, some people are trans, get over it, let's move on. This is all blown out of proportion. And now I sort of sit and reflect and think, actually, there are a lot of complexities. And then he goes on to express concerns about some of the medical interventions that there have been. So as I say, that's not about education, but that does show where Labour stands as far as medical treatment is concerned on this issue, and I think you can expect that has some carryover to education as well. The Cass review is clear that there's no evidence to support medics automatically affirming children in the gender they say they are. It's also really clear that social transition in schools is significant and that it has a psychological impact. So I think it follows logically. There's also no evidence that it's beneficial for schools to automatically agree to children socially transitioning, and that actually it's potentially harmful. And the Cass review report draws attention to the significance of the decisions over social transition that happen in schools, and it talks about the particular difficulties that are created for children where that takes place before puberty, which leads to children living in stealth and becoming increasingly anxious about being found out by their classmates, especially with the oncoming advent of puberty, that will make their real sex start to become obvious. And it says that drives demand for puberty blockers. So we don't know precisely where Labour stand on this issue, but it's probably fair to say they're in a different place to where they were a few years ago. And then turning to the Liberal Democrats, I'll stop the share. Hang on. So in 2020, they passed a policy stating that trans women are women, trans men are men, and non-binary identities are non-binary. And in 2015, Jo Swinson, who was at that time Minister for Equalities in the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, announced grants of £2 million, which were paid to groups including Diversity Role Models, Stonewall, an educational action challenging homophobia, and those grants were to combat HBT bullying in schools. But in many cases, what actually happened is that led to policies in schools which promoted trans ideology and sex positivity. And sex positivity is a belief that any boundary or social norm that limits sexual behaviour is harmful, except the requirement for consent. So all sexual acts with any consenting sexual partner or partners are to be celebrated. Now, of course, Christian teachers should be the first to be concerned about HBT bullying, as we should about any other bullying. But some of these programmes promoted the idea that a girl might really be a boy or vice versa, and some of them that the only and sole boundary around appropriate sexual activity is consent. But having highlighted that was a Liberal Democrat minister in the coalition government, it's only fair to point out that when in the next election, when the Conservative Party won an outright majority, the government just made more grants to Stonewall, Equality, Educate and Celebrate, and others. In relation to the Cass report, the Liberal Democrats have said very, very little that's specific. Their comments are focused on the length of waiting lists and the problems of a toxic debate. So that's where they are. So I think what's clear is this debate on transgender is in a state of flux. There's a real shift in attitudes. We have this detailed proposed guidance from the Conservative government, but politicians and parties are still working out where they stand following the Cass report. And as a teacher or school governor, you're in a really good position to talk to candidates in the election about this. You can tell them what's going on in your school. Probably best not to name it, although you could be free air if it's your current MP. You could ask them how they think the school should respond. You can share the problems with them, including the problems you think their suggested response could cause. You can ask them what their party is going to do about it and what they will do about it if elected. So that's a transgender issue. I want to talk in a minute about relationships, sex, health and health education, but I thought I'd pause there so we can have some questions, particularly on that issue or other general questions before we continue.
Yeah, great, thanks. I've got a few questions that have come through, a couple asking for a little bit of clarification. So one person has said that they didn't quite follow. Could you just explain again why you thought Labour's Education Secretary comment was potentially a good thing?
Yeah, I wasn't going as far as to saying it was a good thing, but it's non-committal. It's very, very vague. You know, she says as little as possible in her statement. Now, you know, I would obviously much prefer it. I think it'd be much better if she came down clearly critical of transgender ideology and saying no child should ever be transitioned in school. But I don't think it was realistic to expect her to say that. But what was encouraging is that she didn't attack this draft guidance from the Conservative Party. Lots and lots of people have been attacking it all over the media. And despite this being a party political thing where you'd expect the Labour Party to attack the Conservative Party for something they've said in the guidance, the Labour Party didn't do that at all. Perhaps because they know they're divided and different points of view within the Labour Party, partly because perhaps they felt that might go against them in an election, which is a positive sign if they think that, and something that can be built on in the election in what people say to their candidates. And the fact that the Labour Party hasn't committed themselves to opposing that guidance from the Conservative government has produced means, you know, people can ask their Labour candidates in the election what they think, and there's no party line on it that constrains them.
Great, thank you. There's another question on something that's related to that. Are parties likely to include their position on the Cass report in their manifestos?
It's possible they'll say something. I mean, I don't. No party is opposing the Cass report. Well, that's not quite true. The Green Party in Scotland is opposing it. But other parties who in the past have been, you know, completely down the sort of Stonewall route, are now saying, oh well, this is a careful report. We must study it closely. They're not perhaps committing themselves on how the government should respond, but they're supporting the CAS review as a serious piece of proper research and review with good recommendations which the government needs to consider. So I don't think they'll depart from that line. Some parties might go a little bit further in what they say about specifically what the government should do. But I mean, the CAS review has got a whole set of recommendations in it for the NHS, and I think that there won't be many politicians who are going to be opposing those recommendations.
And and again, this is related to CAS now, and I think I could probably answer this, but it says, does the CAS review affirm or deny that gender is a spectrum?
I'm trying to remember in all the hundreds of pages of it whether it specifically addresses the issue of the spectrum. Maybe you can answer it, Lizzie, as you said you might be able to. I can't remember whether it comments on that.
I don't think there's any kind of technical affirmation that there is a spectrum of genders that should be taught about or that should be spoken about. However, I think when I've heard Hilary Cass herself say that the kind of the embodiment, the kind of manifestation of one's identity seems to be more fragmented, and therefore maybe it's healthier to see being male and female as not so clear cut. But I don't think there's anything that's actually in the review that would be of use to medics that would ever affirm that as a kind of a party line. Because obviously that was dealing with the NHS and the medical treatment for young people who generally were distressed because they believed that their sex did not match up to their gender identity. I don't think there's anything in the CAS review that affirms the idea of gender being a spectrum, but I'm not entirely sure that her perspective on it would be in the same vein as what we believe as Bible believing Christians. But I certainly don't think that. I think
she's very, very careful not to commit herself on one side of the argument ideologically, so that her report doesn't get dismissed, I think. And she's purely looking at evidence that social transition is helpful, evidence that puberty blockers are helpful, evidence that cross-sex hormones are helpful. So she's that, and looking at the treatment protocols around that. So she's kind of being agnostic, as it were, on the ideological questions and just looking at the evidence. But I think if you look at the evidence, that probably does lead you to a conclusion, really, on the ideological question. But she's not going to go there explicitly.
And now for our second topic, relationship, sex and health education.
Okay, so relationship education and health education were introduced by a Conservative government, along with some changes to the law and guidance around sex education, and that was in 2017, although they didn't come into force until 2020. But in 2017, they were actually acting in response to amendments that had been made by Labour backbenchers, Stella Creasy and others, which then the Conservative government adopted with some modifications. At the time, Labour and Liberal Democrats didn't oppose those changes to RSHE, as it's now called. Some individual MPs expressed reservations, but in the end, only 21 voted against them. One was a Labour MP who was then criticised and then just said he'd made a mistake and accidentally voted the wrong way. The others were Conservative or DUP or independent MPs. And those changes that were brought in September 2020, they've really been the catalyst for a widespread introduction of teaching, which I think has caused real problems. not in every school perhaps, but in many. In ACT's own research last year, 45% of Christian teachers said they'd been expected to deliver content that conflicted with their views on marriage, relationships, gender or sexuality. Nearly a third said that gender identity theory was presented as fact. And in some of these cases, the schools are going beyond what the law and the guidance require that were introduced in 2020, maybe are even in breach of education law and guidance. But nevertheless, it was those changes that came into force in 2020 which enabled this to happen. So that really was the trigger anyway. Almost as soon as the new requirements came in September 2020, the Conservative government started to backpedal a little, put in further measures. So they issued supplementary guidance in September 2020, which tried to limit the negative impact it would have and said some useful things. They also issued new guidance later on political impartiality, and that was to address a range of issues, but including biased teaching in RSHE. So they're trying to make sure that where teachers presented contested views, that it was clear that this was something that was controversial and people disagreed about, rather than presenting a contested view as fact. Then the Conservative Education Secretary, sent letters to schools instructing them to allow parents to see teaching materials in RSHE. And then in the beginning of March last year, the Prime Minister acknowledged the concerns about what was being taught in RSHE, and he said he was bringing forward a review of the statutory guidance. And after some delay, eventually just last week, new draft guidance was published for consultation. So that tells schools they should not teach about gender identity, and if asked about it, they should just teach the facts about biological sex. And they shouldn't use any material that presents the idea that gender is a spectrum, as if it's a fact, nor should they suggest that someone's gender is determined by their interests or clothing choices. It puts in place minimum ages at which particular topics can be taught. There's a clear statement that relationships education, and that's the part which parents can't withdraw their children from, relationships education should not include topics which involve explaining or describing different forms of sexual activity. It requires schools to make sure parents are aware of what's being taught and to tell parents how they can view all curriculum materials. It says that schools must ask visiting speakers to provide their lesson plan and materials in advance, and schools should seek the views of parents on that. And schools must be clear with parents that they can withdraw their children from sex education, and must be clear which parts of their curriculum are sex education. It also says pupils should learn and should know that families are important for children growing up because they provide love, security and stability, the characteristics of healthy family life, including commitment to each other, including in times of difficulty, protection and care for children and other family members, the importance of spending time together and sharing each other's lives, and stable, caring relationships at the heart of happy families are important for children's security as they grow up, and that marriage represents a formal and legally recognised commitment of two people to each other, which is intended to be lifelong. It says schools can most commonly refer to families with a mother and a father when discussing families, but should be sensitive to pupils' circumstances. It also introduces new teaching on vaping, the potential harm to the developing adolescent brain. That's a big issue in many schools. And like the current guidance, it says that faith perspectives can be discussed in any school, and that schools must consult parents on their plans whenever they review their policy, make clear that parents can withdraw their children from sex education. Obviously, there's a great deal more that could be said about that draft guidance, which you can go online and find on the Department for Education's consultation page, and you can respond to that consultation. From a Christian perspective, it's not perfect guidance, certainly, but I think it's a significant improvement on the current version. And I'm expecting this consultation on the draft guidance is going to continue over the period of the election, because it's already been announced before Thursday next week when everything sort of stops. So that will just continue to run, but it's going to be up to whoever wins the next election to decide how the government's going to respond to that consultation and what the final guidance is going to say. So that's the actions of the Conservative Party. We could look at what the Labour Party has said about it. I'll just read this. I'm sorry, I don't think I've got a slide of this. So Catherine McKinnell, who's the Shadow Minister for Schools, she said, the opposition believe that what matters about families is not the shape they have, but the love they give. Teaching children about the facts of the world in which they grow up must include an understanding that there are people who are transgender, that people can go through a process to change their gender, and that the law provides for that. Labour very much welcomes the intention of the guidance to remove the barriers that some parents face when asking what is being taught to their children. Of course, parents should know what their children are being taught. While providers are already required to do this, it's acknowledged that there have been issues with interpretations of copyright legislation, and it's absolutely right that ministers seek to clarify this issue. In other words, to remove the excuse from the schools that they can't show parents' materials because it's copyright. We also welcome the inclusion of content on sexual harassment and sexual violence. I hope that as part of the review, the government will look at some of the fantastic resources local authorities have developed while waiting for the government to act. Bridget Phillipson, who is the Shadow Minister for Education, said it's important that children have a wide understanding about their place in the world, understand that families come in different shapes and sizes, and understand issues about relationships. But of course, that has to be done in a way that is age appropriate, and parents have to be involved, and they should be able to see what their children are being taught and understand what's going on within school. And she said it's important that it's age appropriate. And on transgender issues, she said, Shadow Minister for Education, Bridget Phillipson, it saddens me that so much of this discussion about how we teach our young people about trans issues more widely has become political knockabout and has become about what would be Tory leadership contenders seeking to get headlines on that basis. This is about our children's well-being. And Keir Starmer said he would take time to read the details before deciding whether to keep the guidance if elected. So that's the Labour Party on relationships, sex and health education. I'm not being able to find any official statement from the Liberal Democrats. Their education spokesperson, Munira Wilson, was the only Liberal Democrat MP who contributed to the debate on the guidance in Parliament. And she talked about sexually transmitted infections and said that the Children's Commissioner has similarly attributed that shocking increase in sexually transmitted infections to the fact we're not teaching our kids what they need to hear. Will the Secretary of State explain to the House how she thinks a new guidance, which seems to suggest that sexually transmitted infections will not be taught about before year 9, age 13 or 14, will address those shocking rates? So, as with the pastoral guidance, there are changes afoot in the curriculum in this area. I'll pause again now if there's any questions, particularly about relationships, sex and health education.
Thanks, John. There's not as many on this, and I think you've in essence answered one of the main questions, which was, will a new government scrap the new guidance for RSHE as the consultation closes on the 11th of July, which obviously is after the date of the general election on the 4th of July. So I think you've
it'll just run, and then it'll be the Department for Education usually takes a few weeks or months sometimes longer to look at the results of consultation, and then finishes off, issues the final version of the policy. But obviously when that's issued, that will be under the next government, whoever that is.
Absolutely. Okay, so we do have other questions. Questions on those two topics that you've covered already have kind of dried up a little, but I don't know whether it would be okay to ask you a few other questions now.
Yes, of course.
And we will certainly we'd be very happy to have more questions if you want to type into Mentimeter. So if you are still unaware, or if you're very happy to reveal your name, that's absolutely fine. You can type them on here, but if you just go to the link in Menti, you can do that there anonymously. So I will go through, in no particular order, a question on the daily act of collective worship. Will that be in danger under a new government? So apparently there was a survey on Teacher Tapp, and approximately 70% of head teachers said that they would like to scrap the legal requirement for there to be a daily act of collective worship. Do you think that this could be in peril under a new government?
Well, I don't know, because I don't think any party has said anything about that, as far as I know. It is a bit of a political hot potato. I think all parties recognise that, and a bit wary of making changes. Of course, it's ignored in a lot of schools, isn't it? So you could. The other question would be. So you got the question. Well, is there any likelihood of there being a change in the law? My guess would be not, but I mean, who knows? The other question is, will any of the parties be more likely to enforce the law on that? So I asked this question to Nick Gibb, who was then Minister for the School System, and he said, if it's not being, it is the law. If schools aren't doing it, and a parent's concerned about that, or teachers concerned about that, they should draw that to the attention of the Department for Education, and they will ensure the law is enforced. And he was he's a Conservative MP, so as a Conservative minister. Having said that, I'm not aware of any examples where that's actually happened. But there you go. Yeah, so I don't know. Obviously, Humanist UK is one of the groups that campaigns for a change of the law there, but they've got there are MPs in all parties who are members of Humanists UK.
Yes, it is interesting that there are, in the last census, there are only in England and Wales, only about 10,000 people said that they were humanists. Obviously, I know that there are many more that don't subscribe to religion. But yes, I just found that out earlier on in the week. Another question, this is much more of a general question, and you may or may not be able to answer this, but how many Bible-believing Christians are there in Parliament? And are there any new candidates, prospective parliamentary candidates who are Christians?
Well, I don't know about new candidates. There are Christian MPs in all three of the main parties that I mentioned. How many there are? Well, I don't really know. I mean, there are at least a dozen, but I don't know exactly. I could sort of sit down and try and think of some names and write a list and try to count them up, but I wouldn't have got all of them. So, but there are Christian MPs, Bible-believing Christian MPs in all three parties.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, sometimes the Christian Institute do interviews with Christian MPs. So please do go and check out their website. I think you've got one with Miriam Cates on at the moment, who obviously we know is a former science teacher herself, and did a lot of campaigning for a review into RSHE materials. I'm sure there are many Christians in other parties as well, and there is an organisation called Christians in Parliament, or Christians in Politics, but there are two different organisations, I think, and I believe that there are Christians who actually across the different sides of the houses have very good relationships and even pray together and read the Bible together. So we must be praying for those Christians who are our elected representatives. Another question is, sorry, just let me scroll down. This is one that may be a little more difficult for you to answer. And it says perhaps more of an observation for those in the independent sector, which may include many independent Christian schools, small, quite financially vulnerable Christian schools. It's likely they'll find it difficult to vote for Labour, given their stated view thus far on charging VAT on fees. Is this likely to remain?
They seem very committed to it. They've had a lot of pushback against it, and people sort of doing analyses and seeming to show that it's not going to bring in a significant amount of money, and it may just result in more pupils being transferred into the state system and costing the state. So there's been that sort of technical pushback. There's been concerns from small independent schools, which are often are the faith in the faith sector, but they've been pretty solid on that policy. Really, Bridget Phillipson is even, I think she's been almost quite insulting of the Independent Schools Association when it raised concerns about it. I'm not sure if they've completely sorted the policy out, though, because it's not clear whether it will apply to independent schools outside of England. Decisions on things like VAT would usually be UK wide, but then education, as I said earlier, is devolved. So is an education secretary who only has responsibility for schools in England going to start interfering in education policy in the devolved nations by imposing VAT on fee-paying schools there? So there are some things that it doesn't look like they've quite thought through perhaps yet, and that, I suppose, might lead them to a different conclusion. But it seems to me they're pretty determined on that policy.
Thank you. Again, another slightly broader question. Some constituencies appear to be very sensitive to Muslim voters. Are Muslim influencers supportive of the views taken by Christians on any of the sexual ethics discussed thus far tonight?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's as I said earlier on, people don't have to be a Christian to agree with you on particular topics. That's true for MPs, and that's true more broadly as well. So yes, we can certainly find common ground with Muslims on some of these issues. You may find sometimes that what they might say about the issues is not exactly the same way that we would talk about them, and I think it's sometimes wise to be just a little bit cautious, but certainly that there is common cause there, and particularly in constituencies with a lot of Muslim parents with children in schools, I think candidates there are probably going to be asked about some of these issues by Muslims as well as by Christians, and in that sense that's all pushing in the same direction, which is helpful.
Great. So I think this will probably be one of our last questions, unless there's any kind of last minute. Again, this is broader, but the most recent question is, could you name a few Labour Christian MPs? The most vocal always seem to be Conservative. This concerns me given the suggested likelihood of a Labour government. I don't know whether you're able to do that, John. Obviously, I mentioned Miriam Cates. For balance, can we have a Labour Christian MP?
I'm wanting to say Stephen Twigg, and then I'm thinking, no, it's not Stephen Twigg. It's Stephen
Timms.
Timms.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Guy. That was the name I had in my mind. So he's certainly a clear Bible believing Christian. But there'll be others on the Labour benches as well who, would certainly call themselves Christians and would, there would be a bit of a spectrum of belief. There are quite a number of Roman Catholic Labour MPs, of course. I mean, Wes Streeting describes himself as a Christian. I mean, he's not a very regular church attender, but he certainly would describe himself as a Christian. So. Yeah, there's obviously there's a spectrum, isn't there? Yeah.
Okay. And do you have any sort of practical advice then for us approaching these prospective parliamentary candidates, because they're going to be run off their feet over the next few weeks? They're going to be campaigning, they're going to be door knocking, they're going to be pounding the streets. Are they really going to be getting back to us when we email them asking them about government guidance on relationships and sex education? Is there anything you can do to get a guaranteed answer?
Well, you can't get a guaranteed answer because some of them will just not want to commit themselves, particularly in writing. But I think it's a case of taking the opportunities. You may not get a response to an email when as you say, they're running around all the time. But if someone comes and knocks on your door and they're wanting to talk to you, then talk to them, and it's quite a good idea probably to have some questions in your mind ready for when that knock on the door comes, or sometimes you even get a phone call. Quite often there are local hustings that are run. Sometimes churches get together to invite candidates. That's an excellent thing. So, if you can sort of promote that within your own church, get together with a number of other local churches, and actually hold some hustings where Christians can, specifically for Christians to ask questions, and you could get together a good number of people in that way, and candidates would welcome the opportunity to come and talk to a larger group like that. You could invite all the candidates, and you could ask them about these issues. But yes, and I mean, for those people who are teachers or school governors, it's just a completely natural thing to be concerned about and to want to ask about.
Yeah.
And if you're also a parent with children in school, you can express your concerns about them as well. So, I don't think we should feel on the back foot at all about this. They're coming to us, asking us to elect them. So, they've got to convince you. So
absolutely,
ask them the questions and give them the opportunity to convince you.
Yes, and I can guarantee you that over the next few weeks will probably be the best opportunity to see your prospective parliamentary candidates in person, because they will be likely to be at some point in your local area. And I know some of mine have been already, and I know that I spoke to one of mine who just happened to have a stall down at our local shops, and I asked her precisely these issues, and actually I found it quite amusing because she didn't actually know the answers, and she didn't seem to be aware of some of the issues. So maybe that's a good thing. Not all of these prospective parliamentary candidates will actually hold a line or even have awareness of these issues. So yeah, get in there first. Have you got any other kind of advice or any other guidance? And how can we be praying? And we will spend just a few moments praying in a minute.
Well, it's a really important thing to pray for, isn't it? Because the results of the election will have a huge impact on the country. So if we can care about the country God has called us to live in, and we care about these issues, we really should care about the election and pray about it. Pray for candidates who are Christians. Pray that they'd have wisdom, that the election would lead to opportunities for them. Christian MPs, that they keep their seat if we think they should, depending on our political views. And we can pray, I think, particularly that in all the debate and all the discussion that there is going to be on the media in the next weeks, that some attention is given to these really key important issues, not just in education but more broadly, that the moral direction in which the next government will lead the country. We should pray that gets an airing, and that within those discussions there are opportunities for the truths that God gives us in his word to be heard by many people, and for them to be discussed, and for those things to be taken seriously, not just dismissed as old hat. And I think there is with things like the Cass Review has shifted the mood, and there are more and more people, I think, taking seriously the idea that actually Christian moral teaching might actually have some truth in it after all, and we can pray that's drawn attention to in during the election, and that actually leads further, and it leads people not just to consider the moral teaching but consider all the claims of Christ, and pray that even the election could be something that the Lord will use to draw people to him in his grace.
Absolutely. And we must continue to pray for people like yourselves at the Christian Institute who have that opportunity to speak to those in power. I know that a lot of work goes on behind the scenes of just very judicious and careful discussions and building up trustworthy kind of relationships, and just doing a wonderful job of really analysing policy as well as doing all the other things you guys do. So we must pray for you.